So, good afternoon. My name is John Rex, and I'm a physician based in the United States. And I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Kozlov and the organizing committee of the meeting for the opportunity to be with you by webinar today. And the topic of my talk is Antibiotics for Unmet Need, the challenge of new drugs for bad bugs. And let me say before I leave this slide that my contact details are on the slide. Quite happy to share the slides if someone wants to drop me a note. Here are my disclosures. I work with a variety of companies around the world. So the topic for today, I'm going to break it up into three pieces. First, I'm going to talk about the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. And then we're going to get into some ideas about ways that we, the user community, the prescribing community, the developer community, can communicate with our peers who do not do antibiotic R&D full-time every day. And then there'll be some messages that are specifically about things that new drug developers should think about. So this is all part of what we as a community need to know in order to educate everybody around us who is interested in antibiotics. So the challenge of antimicrobial resistance has been summarized in a variety of reports. Here I'm going to use the US CDC's 2019 risk assessment. You can find other kinds of reviews that are like this. This is just a good recent one. And what CDC says is that there are nearly 3 million infections and 35,000 deaths every year due to antibiotic-resistant bacteria and fungi. And this kind of spread is driven by the fact that microbes move around with us as we travel the globe. Prior to COVID, I'm sure that right now the map's a little bit different than this. But what CDC said in 2019 was that 1 billion people a year pass through international borders. 1 billion people. Instead of just for the United States, that's 350 million travelers arriving in the US on each year. So a resistant threat can quickly become a threat by moving around the globe at any time. And global capacity is needed to slow the development and spread of antibiotic resistance. So let's talk a little bit about some ideas about antibiotics. And I think it's important to realize just how difficult the discovery of antibiotics is, and that will help us understand why the pipeline is so thin. In one sense, it's easy to find certain things when you do antibiotic R&D. It's easy to find targets. We've sequenced lots of different bacteria. And it's easy to find things that kill bacteria. Bleach works, as do steam and fire. The hard thing is to find things that kill bacteria and that are safe. And you see failures due to a variety of causes, but the safety is the big one. And the reason that safety is so dominant with antibiotics, I think, is twofold. One is we tend to need relatively high doses of our compound in order to get through the blood and then get into the microbe and get across its various membranes. And you can think about a typical dose of a high-end cephalosporin. We're talking about grams a day, and compare that with the dose that you might get for a lipid-lowering agent. So it's really a lot of drug that we give in a relative sense. And the other thing to say about antibiotics is that they are distinct in that they're really one of two classes of drugs where the purpose of the drug is to kill something that's alive. Antibiotics and cancer chemotherapy, and living things just really don't want to die. They're wired for survival. And so the net effect of this challenge with discovery is that our antibiotic pipeline is actually quite thin. The Pew Charitable Trust does a regular update, as does WHO. So again, I'm just picking one. You can look at the others if you'd like. But Pew's recent reviews had looked that there were 42 antibiotics in development, but only a handful of them were reaching the stage of being submitted for regulatory approval. But even more interestingly, only 1 in 4, look on the far right of the slide, only 1 in 4 was actually a truly novel class or a novel mechanism of action. So stated differently, 3 out of 4, or approximately 30 out of 42 of the antibiotics in development are things that are of classes we've already got one of, like maybe another beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitor, or another fluoroquinolone. There are things that we have examples of, and relatively little novelty. And novelty is important because that's actually how you deal with resistance. It's if you can find things that have a truly novel mechanism of action, you're more likely to have activity against a wide variety of pathogens. And so, the implication of this is that every new antibiotic that we do find is a precious jewel that really needs to be preserved very carefully. And that's a theme we'll come back to a couple of times as we go along. Another thing to realize is that approval of a new antibiotic doesn't mean it's available. And that's actually kind of a distressing observation that we've all made recently. For reasons we're going to discuss in more detail, you just look at the US, where since about 2009-10, there have been 15 new antibiotics approved. Of those 15, 5 of them are owned by companies that are now bankrupt or the equivalent thereof. Those 5 drugs are not really readily available. And other companies are teetering on the edge with their new antibiotic. And we think you bring a new drug to market and you think it's a cause for celebration. In fact, these days it's a cause for companies to go out of business, and we will talk about that. Further, even if a drug does get registered in the United States, and that is often the first place drugs get registered, the drug isn't available around the world in a timely fashion. Multi-year delays in availability are typical. And I have a newsletter that we published on the 7th of September that you can see the link for it. By the way, I should have said I have a website where I put up news of interest. There's a newsletter you can subscribe to if you'd like. But you go to this particular copy of the newsletter, and it talks about how European launches can be delayed, sometimes for indefinitely, and observed that there were 4 drugs where the launch does appear to be delayed sort of indefinitely. So, and the delays are all due to lack of commercial viability. For new antibiotics don't sell well. We will discuss that again in a second, but and it causes them to not be available around the world. So you put all that together, and that's saying that antimicrobial resistance is a major challenge, and unfortunately, we're not seeing new antibiotics come to market. And I think it's important that those of us in the medical community know how to talk about this to our peers. And so let's actually talk about some ideas that are important to be able to share. And the first thing I want to do is talk about something that's actually been on every one of my slides so far. Look in the upper right-hand corner. There's a picture of a fire extinguisher. Why do I have a fire extinguisher on my slides? Well, let's think about fire extinguishers, actual fire extinguishers, for a moment. And here's your pop quiz. Have you personally used a fire extinguisher today? I'd like you to think about that carefully, because I know that your temptation will be to say, well, no, actually I didn't. Nothing caught on fire around me. My apartment building did not burn down. Well, let me try it again. Could it be that you are using a fire extinguisher right now? And you might wonder, well, if I keep asking this, maybe I have an ulterior motive with this question. Are you using a fire extinguisher right now? Well, I'm going to actually argue that yes, you are. Is there a fire? Are you in a building? Or do you have a fire extinguisher in your kitchen? If a fire broke out, would you expect something useful to happen? And I think the answer to that question is yes. And so I'm going to argue that indeed you are using a fire extinguisher right now. The only part you're not using of the fire extinguisher that's in the building around you is the part that gets you wet. Everything else about it you are using. We have paid for that fire extinguisher. We make sure that it's available at all times. And so we're actually using fire extinguishers basically all the time. A variation on this question is to say, do you have life insurance? Well, I have life insurance. Did my life insurance pay off today? No, fortunately not. I didn't actually need to have it pay me in the event of my death, because I'm still here chatting with you. And I'm actually quite pleased about that. I'm happy to have life insurance and not have it pay off today. So I think fire extinguishers, life life insurance have a lot of qualities in common. And you come back to fire extinguishers and antibiotics as this tool. The fundamental starting point really is that antibiotics enable all of healthcare. They are the safety net for everything we do: surgery, cancer therapy, taking care of newborn babies. And they're essential infrastructure for civilization. So, stated a little differently, antibiotics as fire extinguishers have benefits that go beyond their simple use. So, fire extinguishers make it safe to be in your apartment building. Antibiotics make it safe to go and have surgery. And there are a lot of ways you can sort of summarize this. I've got 3 of them here on the slide. Antibiotics have an enabling value. Many surgical and medical procedures rely on prophylaxis with effective antibiotics, or knowing that if something went wrong, you could treat it. They have an option or an insurance value. Having an antibiotic in reserve before we really need it means that we can stop an outbreak before it goes very far. Antibiotics have a diversity value. Having a variety of antibiotics means you don't have to always use the same one to treat any given bacteria, and that may reduce selection pressure and delay the onset of resistance. So this idea of antibiotics as the fire extinguishers of medicine is a really important concept to share with our colleagues. You want the antibiotic in the pharmacy and available, even if you don't actually put it into a human being today. So if we want to have fire extinguishers, and we want to have a variety of fire extinguishers available to us, what's it take? Let's start with the question of how long does it take to invent a new antibiotic? My colleague Kevin Otterson put together this graphic of the time from discovery to FDA approval for drugs of a variety of classes. And look at the x-axis, which is marked in decades. And then for each one of the arrows, like things for MRSA, pick one: oxazolidinones, 40 years. A cephalosporin that worked for Staph aureus, it took a long time to invent one of those. Or for MDR-TB, the diarylquinolones, it took 20 years to bring one of those to the market. So it takes a while. And I'm going to say it particularly takes a long time if what you want is something where you've never had one of them before. So the more novel the compound is, the longer it's going to take to get the first one out of the block. You're going to have lots of trial and error, and much of discovery is about error and trying again, things that fail, and you just have to start again. And the length of time required to invent new antibiotics is actually an important thing to understand, because that's why it costs so much. A number of folks have looked at the cost of inventing new drugs in general, and inventing a new antibiotic is neither more expensive nor cheaper than anything else. It's sort of pretty typical. It's in the range of $1 to $1.5 billion. And a recent review said that it was a $1.5 billion on average to bring a new antibiotic, from discovering it, having all the things that fail along the way, and you finally get the one that succeeds, and it actually gets through FDA, EMA approval. $1.5 billion is a reasonable guess as to what that's going to cost. And that's summarized in a newsletter that's shown on this slide, but it's telling you that, I mean, it's a lot of money for any one antibiotic. And earlier I said any given antibiotic is a precious jewel. It really is precious. A lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of people's lives have gone into inventing that new drug. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to have a strong interest in staying with it over 10 to 20 years and spending a lot of money. So let's now talk a bit about antibiotics and the finances of antibiotics. I'm going to introduce a pair of ideas called push and pull that deal with the question of how you pay for antibiotics. And I'm going to start with the observation that rational stewardship of new antibiotics is something that we've all gotten very interested in over the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years. It's important that we use the right antibiotic, don't use more than what we need, use it for the right period of time. Good stewardship is critical. And good stewardship means that when you have a new antibiotic, we try very hard to limit the sales of that new antibiotic. And that's actually quite a good thing from a community standpoint. And if you look at recently approved antibiotics in the United States, typical sales have been less than $25 million a year for newly approved antibiotics. $25 million a year for a new antibiotic in sales. Well, something that we hadn't really articulated very well until recently was what it costs to keep a new antibiotic on the market. So let's just imagine for a moment that I hand you, here it is, a new antibiotic. I'm going to give you the FDA approval, the EMA approval. I've built the building where the antibiotic is made. I've trained all the staff. Everything is here. And I'm handing it to you, and it's yours. Kind of like I put a new car in the driveway. This is yours. You can drive it away. How much money do you need to run the program that makes the antibiotic and does the paperwork around taking care of the antibiotic and addresses post-approval questions? When you get a new drug approved, there are always post-approval commitments. We need to study for this. We need to do pediatrics. It's one of the simplest ones you need to finish is you need $50-60 million to finish a pediatric program. So what are you going to need to keep the lights on for the next 10 years? Well, the answer is you're going to need about $350 million. And that $350 million doesn't include doing anything really new with the antibiotic. No major new studies. It's just making the drug. That's about $25 million a year to run the plant. And another $10 million a year, roughly, over the next 10 years for various kinds of post-approval commitments like pediatrics. So you can do $350 million to break even. So if you think about sales of $25 million a year, you're clearly not going to cover the cost of even just making the drug. And you're going to repay the various investors who got you here. Here I've another quote for cost to approval, $1.3 billion. You got a lot of folks who put money into you in order to bring the drug to fruition. No way you're going to pay for that either. So the theme here is that investing in a new antibiotic is really a terrible business decision. You could say it's just completely mad to put your time and energy and your money into a new antibiotic, because almost certainly the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to go out of business. And that's why those drugs have failed. That's why of the last 15 drugs approved in the United States, 5 are in bankruptcy or the equivalent thereof. So, what are we going to do about that? Well, let's do one more experiment that I think, a little thought experiment that I think is helpful to answering the question, what are we going to do about it? So COVID, which has clearly rearranged the world, which is why I'm speaking to you electronically rather than in person. Here's a thought experiment. You own a company that has developed a novel small molecule with broad activity against all the coronaviridae. You've shown that it shortens the duration of upper respiratory illness symptoms for the coronaviridae strains that cause sort of the common cold. And there's some activity for SARS and MERS, but there's no clinical data because there are currently so no cases, basically. And we have a time machine, and you've gone back to January of 2019, so a little over 2 years ago, a little under 2 years ago. And on January 1st, 2019, you have received FDA and EMA approval for your new drug for coronavirus. It's a tablet. You take it twice a day, and it does all the things that I show on this slide. What are your sales in 2019? Could you have stayed in business? And what's the fix? Well, obviously, your sales were zero because SARS and MERS, and people aren't going to buy this for the common cold because common cold goes away so quickly. Could you have stayed in business? No, not realistically. And what's the fix? Well, this is the new idea that I want to introduce. It's a thing called a pull incentive. Now, pull incentive is the idea of money that comes to you as the innovator for the new drug that you received, whether or not the drug is used to treat an infection, whether it actually goes into a human being. It's sort of like being the manufacturer of a fire extinguisher. Fire extinguisher gets paid to deliver fire extinguishers, whether or not the fire extinguisher is used to put out a fire. Same concept. A pull incentive is a payment that is delinked from use in the sense of injecting it into a human being. But use in terms of having it in the pharmacy, now that's quite different. If it's available and it makes you feel safe, that is a form of use that enables medical care. And we distinguish pull incentives, the things that you're paid when you bring it to registration, from push incentives. Push incentives are the idea of grants. I give you some money to go and start a company, or I provide you with a low-cost loan or whatever. So that's a push incentive that pushes you to do some work. But pull is the work that causes you to bring the drug onto the market and keep it on the market. So we, like that coronaviridae drug, the imaginary drug that in January 2019 had essentially no market value, but now today would actually be quite an important thing. And we've been discussing the idea of push and pull extensively for the last 10 years at least. It really started in the early 2000s when the Infectious Diseases Society of America began to write papers entitled things like Bad Bugs, No Drugs. And along the way, we invented the acronym that some of you will know called the ESCAPE pathogens, the ESKAPE, escape pathogens. But it really got started in earnest to this question of what are we going to do about paying for the new antibiotics? In 2000 and late 2000s, when we all began to recognize that companies were not going to be able to maintain their discovery efforts because stewardship was causing people to think about using drugs differently. And it just became apparent that the economics of antibiotics were much worse than we'd ever realized. And so there's been a lot of work over the last 10 years to deal with this question of how do you create an antibiotic and pay for its creation and then pay to keep it on the market when you actually would rather not put it into human beings unless you really have to. And so the effort that's been going on, there are a variety of things you can read about here. There's the United Kingdom had a thing called the AMR review. We did a project called Drive AB. There's been some legislative work going on. There's a Swedish pilot project. Read all about those in various newsletters. But this key is this thing about push and pull incentives. And when we looked at what needed to happen, the push part, incentives that encourage work to get started, the grants, everybody's willing to do that. And it actually doesn't cost that much at the early stages. 10 to $40 million is actually enough money to start a company, to progress some new leads to phase 1 and see whether you might have a new compound. But it really gets expensive when you want to move into phase 2 and phase 3. And then to keep it on the market, as I've been discussing, once you get it approved, that doesn't actually mean you can keep going, because people are not going to be buying your antibiotic if buying it means putting it into human beings. So it's this idea of pull incentives as a key new theme. And I spent a lot of time on these two words because I really want you to embed them in your brain. Push and pull are the kinds of incentives that are going to make a difference for keeping antibiotics available. And we've actually got a lot of push incentives out there. It's pretty easy to raise the money to start a little company. What we now need are the pull incentives that will pay an innovator for having created a new antibiotic. And if you look at the push incentives that are available, it's actually a rather a large amount of money. $750 million is been at least put recently into encouraging new companies. There's a thing called CARB-X that provides funding, the Novo Repair Project, various projects out of the European Commission, all of which have provided push funding. There's a very recently announced one called the AMR Action Fund that was an effort of the medium and large size pharma companies to say that they understood that maybe they couldn't do all the discovery work, but they could contribute to doing phase 2 and phase 3. And so they put together $1 billion to fund phase 2 and phase 3 programs. The goal of the AMR Action Fund is to bring 2 or 3 new antibiotics, maybe 4, to approval by the end of 2030 by using this $1 billion very selectively. That's still push funding because it doesn't deal with what happens after you get approved. This idea of pull payments made without regard for use. And here's where it's been slow, but we are making progress. So there's a thing called the UK pilot that is a subscription model. The UK has said that they want to find 2 antibiotics that they will buy whether or not they use them in their patients. They're going to buy them, and they're willing to pay up to £10 million a year for 10 years for this good new antibiotic. And if you do a little math on that, £10 million a year, it's interesting. 10 millions of pounds a year for 10 years is 100 million pounds. Multiply that by the fact that the UK is about 3% of the G20, so scale it up 33-fold. And the 100 million pounds becomes 3.3 billion pounds. Turn that into dollars, is about $4 billion. And $4 billion as the implied value to the global community of a new antibiotic is right on target. We've done a lot of economic research, particularly this program called Drive AB, but also the UK pilot itself did some economic research on this. And somewhere in the range of $2 to $4 billion is what we as a global community should be paying for the fire extinguisher value of a new antibiotic. If you're a company who invents a really interesting new fire extinguisher, new antibiotic, you should receive over 10 years or so about it's something up to $4 billion. And it's exciting to see the UK having said that that's the value that we need to deliver. And the next thing to do is to engage and extend this to other countries. The wealthy countries need to contribute their fair share. The targets have to be fair and must be consistently available. And so far, there is one other activity that's pushing this direction. It's a bit of legislation introduced in the United States recently called the Pasteur Act. We have yet to see other countries engage, but it's exciting to see the UK and the US starting. Yeah, I can't expect it to happen around the world simultaneously. But it really is fun to see this having happened. So with all that as background about messages that we need to share, what are some implications? So if you're interested in antibiotic R&D, if you might be thinking about doing antibiotic R&D, perhaps some of you are, I want to point out some implications here for plausible new drugs. It's also saying something to the prescriber community. You're not going to, and the message that we're going to get to is you're not going to get very many new drugs, so take good care of them. So let's look at all that. And I think, yeah, I've pointed at this idea a couple of times in the talk, but let me just make it really clear. It's this thing called the antibiotic paradox, which is that if you invent a bad antibiotic, nobody's going to use it. But if you invent a really good antibiotic, use will be very, very limited. And in both cases, prices will be low by modern standards. And I'd like to thank Ralph Wagner for stating this so clearly. Bad antibiotics, nobody uses. Good antibiotics, people really try very, very hard not to use them. That's an important idea to work with. We want and the use here has to be used to put out a fire, used to treat a patient. Having it available in the pharmacy is a different thing, as we've been discussing. And so core message is that sales income is usually not going to suffice to cover the cost of keeping the new drug on the market. Going forward, the main way that a new product will generate value will be from a Dlinked Poll award of some kind. And I've pointed out the Pasteur Act in the US and the UK subscription pilot. What I haven't said is, what are they looking for? So both of them are really clear that they're going to lay out some rules for what creates an interesting new antibiotic. So novel mechanism, reliable spectrum, no cross resistance, ease of use, being oral, for example, would be nice. IV is good, but oral, that has really extends the use a lot. And other sorts of really clearly measurable features. And so I encourage you here to go to the website and look at the papers about the newsletters about Pasteur and the UK pilot. And you'll see, the UK pilot's been very explicit about a point scoring system for how you decide how much an antibiotic should be worth. And if you're going to be doing R&D, you need to understand this and then ask yourself, is the project that I'm doing likely to measure up? If not, do you really want to continue doing that project? Maybe you should be doing something else with your time. And I also want to say that as interesting as they are, not all products are developable. And that's important as well if you're thinking about how you're going to spend your time. And I want to talk about some of the kinds of products that I get asked about routinely. So what about inhaled products? Yeah, that's one that it took me a while to wrap my head around this. Inhaled product for pneumonia actually sounds like a really might sound like it would be a good thing. But in fact, it's much, much harder than you would imagine to develop a new inhaled antibiotic in a way that is reliably usable. And you can do it for cystic fibrosis. And it was recently been done for Mycobacterium avium intracellulare. But outside of that, it's really surprisingly hard. And so there's a whole newsletter about that if you want to read about that. What about synergy via combinations? This is another idea that comes up a lot. I want to invent something that will work with something else. Well, depending on what you're doing, it can be a fine idea. So if what you're going to do is restore the activity of a known antibiotic, like you can add a beta-lactamase inhibitor to a beta-lactam, that's a perfectly fine idea. That works really well because we know how beta-lactams, reliable activity. If you're going to just protect them from enzymatic destruction, great, that works. But synergy, the idea that new will make old more effective, because you think about the BLI, the beta-lactamase inhibitor thing, you're not making the beta-lactam work better than it did before. You're just making it possible to work because you're blocking the thing that's going to destroy it. But with that block in place, it's just the same old activity of a beta-lactam. Is there a way to make beta-lactams work better? As an example, you're going to add something to an old drug, and now the two of them are going to do something that neither one could ever do before. That's actually very, very hard and very, very rare. And the tricky thing about it, from a development standpoint, is that you're going to have to design your studies so that you prove that new plus old is better than old in a setting where old works. Think about that for a second. We're not going to be interested in doing a trial where one of the arms we randomize to is a setting where the old doesn't work. We actually insist in an antibiotic trial on both arms being things that you would be willing to take. You have to have equipoise about both sides of the randomization. Infections can be fatal. You don't get a do-over with an infection. It's not like a migraine where I can delay therapy, and if you've still got a headache, I can start you on something, and the only downside is your head hurt a little bit longer. With a pneumonia, you might be dead if I don't give you a good antibiotic. And so we actually it's very, very, very rare to prove superiority in antibiotic studies. We work very hard to avoid that. What about narrow spectrum antibiotics? This is another one that from a distance, it sounds like a great idea. Why wouldn't we like a narrow spectrum antibiotic? It would kill only the bacterium of interest. It wouldn't disturb our microbiome. It wouldn't give us diarrhea. It sounds like a great thing. I'd like a narrow spectrum antibiotic. Well, the problem is that early in the course of an infection, it's hard to know the infecting bug with certainty. And there's a strong desire to cover the entire spectrum. This in turn constrains your ability to enroll and treat only with the narrow spectrum antibiotic. It just makes it hard to do the trial. So, in order to develop a narrow spectrum antibiotic, you end up reducing it down to one of two ideas. One is almost like it's trivial. It's the setting where the disease is one bug, gonorrhea, or the setting where you really almost always know exactly the one bug, like endocarditis. I mean, we tend to know the bug in endocarditis. The alternative is settings where you have a partner that has we'll call it like a hole in its coverage, sort of like there's an exact gap inside the partner antibiotic. And you can do that sometimes, like Acinetobacter is a place where most drugs don't cover Acinetobacter. So like a cephalosporin typically doesn't cover it. So if I put a cephalosporin with a new drug and I treat Acinetobacter successfully, then the new drug is the only way that the Acinetobacter got treated. So, I mean, it's possible. That's still quite a narrow window for developing a narrow spectrum antibiotic. And what about a narrow spectrum antibiotic for E. coli? I mean, it's just hard to develop for the reasons that I've laid out here. And I have to say, it's important to realize these are not regulatory hurdles, and it's easy to misunderstand these issues. Fundamentally, they're not regulatory issues that are going to be fixed by a regulatory change. It's really that the regulators are the first group who articulate the key question of who's going to benefit? How do we identify that group? What's the benefit that's received? So it's important to recognize all of these challenges for the developer. And I think the easiest fix, I'm not saying it's an easy fix, but of all the things that you can be doing, the thing you can control is the novelty of the program you're working on. The world needs new fire extinguishers, new kinds of fire extinguishers. Put your energy into something that is clearly different. So let me close. And I two quotes for you here. I just these two guys, they always make me smile to think about. First, Francis Picabia, who's pointed out, why is your head round? You may never have thought about that. Your head is round so that your thinking can change direction. Great quote. And then Edwin Land, who invented instant photography. Don't undertake a project unless it is manifestly important and nearly impossible. A great quote. So the AMR problem is now very well defined. And after 10 years of effort, we now actually understand very well the the financial issues that make antibiotic development such an economically infeasible activity. We actually have to approach it very differently. And the solutions have emerged. Push funding is familiar and is having an effect. And the big mental shift is this new idea of pull. We have to think very differently about antibiotics. Antibiotics are the fire extinguishers of medicine. I hope you've learned that from the icon on every one of these slides. And like other infrastructure, we have to buy them in advance. And if you're going to be developing new antibiotics, and I hope some of you are, please invent something new. The world will pay for innovative fire extinguishers. I work on a regular basis to drive it forward so that we're going to have a different way of reimbursing new fire extinguishers, new antibiotics in the future. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope that the rest of the conference has gone well. And again, thank you to Dr. Kozlov and the meeting planners for giving me this opportunity to be with you by video. The fire extinguishers of medicine. Stay safe.